I appreciate that. And people might say, where? Where did we start seeing the Trinity in the Old Testament? You see it again in the very same chapter where it says, we. God refers to himself as we, plurally. How can God refer to himself plurally? And some people say, well, the Queen of England does that. The plural of majesty was not used in Hebrew at that time. It was not convention. And then also when God says, we will create man in our image, male and female, we will make man. Male and female, in his image, and then it goes to plurality once again. Multiple times plurality in the Godhead.
Dr. Heiser, in your book you argue that this Deuteronomy 32 worldview throws light on this famous text from the very first chapter of the Bible.
Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness.
Many ancient Catholic readers have thought that here in Genesis 1, God, that is the Father, must have been talking to the Logos, to the pre-human Jesus, just before creating, when he says, let us make. And later Trinitarian readers have taken these plural pronouns to be hints of the Trinity, but you don't agree with either reading. Why?
That's correct, I don't. I would say if no other divine plurality passages existed in the Hebrew Bible, especially something like Psalm 82, if you wiped those right off the table, that they weren't in the Hebrew Bible, then I would say, well, maybe that works. Maybe one of those two options will work. But because of what we see in divine plurality passages elsewhere, you can't, make these assumptions. There's no way exegetically to limit what happens there to 2 or 3 entities. And because we have this wider world of divine plurality, it makes a lot more sense to take this as God speaking to the heavenly host, again, undefined numerically, because we don't have any numerical indicators there. And he's announcing his intention to a group. Let us make, humankind in our image. Well, we get these plurals, and then when the creating actually happens, the plurals sort of revert back to singulars. Then it's God creating humankind in his image. I think the most natural reading of that, especially since Genesis 1, and of course Genesis 2 and 3 and on through really Genesis 11, is really tracking on other ancient Near Eastern texts for polemic purposes. And scholars, again, this is not anything new with me, scholars have known this for centuries, that really from Genesis 1 through 11, almost everything in there that is relating especially to the first 3 chapters, Genesis 6, the flood, and then on into Babel, almost everything in there is taking a swipe, taking a shot at the spiritual worldview of polytheistic cultures of which Israel was familiar and which Israel is rival to, or are rival to, the Israelite faith, the elevation of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And this is a classic case because we do have, in other ancient Near Eastern texts, almost word for word in some instances in Genesis 1 and 2, even down to syntactical constructions. This scene here takes a shot at the Babylonian creation story of humanity. In that case, it's a God speaking again to a group. And there are similarities. And that literature is older. So when the Hebrew Bible is composed here, this is an intelligent decision to mimic something in some other religion and then give it a poke in the eye by virtue of asserting your own theological position. When this scene is created, there's a reason why, again, there's a familiarity built, and then there's a departure theologically from, again, this ancient Mesopotamia, in this case, creation story. We get this announcement to the group, hey, let's do this. But when the God of Israel creates and acts, he alone, again, the verb forms are all singular, the pronouns become singular. He alone is making the decision to create and is actually the one creating male and female humanity. And he's announcing that, and there's some relationship that group has to what's happening, but they are not co-creators there. So the singular language, again, you could actually use against, the sort of co-creating language that you would need with the logos figure. Well, the logos figure is not even in view here. Again, this is polemic language to distance what's happening from other, again, accounts, other religions, other beliefs in the ancient Near East that the writer of Genesis, again, has taken a shot at. So it just makes a lot more sense contextually in what we're dealing with, and also not reading the New Testament back into the Old. It makes sense contextually just to sort of read it for what it is. God announces to a group, this is what we're going to do, and then he does it. He acts on his own behalf, his own creative power, and the result is humanity. So that also has the benefit of, if we look at Genesis 1 this way, and then we encounter these other divine plurality passages, especially where the guys in the other room, the divine characters in the room, let's just put it that way. When you get the divine characters in the same room, and some of them turn out to be bad and under judgment, and they're going to die like men, okay, reference back to Psalm 82, then it's easy to decipher that. If all you were thinking was the Trinity from Genesis 1, then starting to encounter these other passages like Psalm 82, now you're in trouble, because now you have the other members of the Trinity as corrupt. Now you have God chastising the Son and the Spirit and saying, hey, you're going to die like men because of what you've done bad here. You're corrupt and evil and wicked. Well, I mean, that just creates a conundrum, which is why in a lot of English translations and a lot of, again, early Christian discussion, Psalm 82, the plural Elohim of Psalm 82 are treated as though they're humans, because they have to get out of that quandary in some respect. They've been thinking divine plurality means the Trinity all the way along. Then when you encounter a passage like Psalm 82, the gods there aren't really gods, they're humans. Well, how in the world does that happen? Well, it basically happens because we need it to happen, because otherwise we're in trouble, theologically, because we haven't been thinking outside the Trinity box. We haven't really been thinking contextually back in Genesis 1.
So to the original reader, the sting of it would be that God is doing all the work and the rest of the deities are just kind of on the sideline, apparently watching. He's talking to them, but he's doing it all.
Yeah, the verbs of creation, when it comes to humanity, really when it comes to the heavens and the earth and human beings, are always singular in the Hebrew Bible. And again, that's a very deliberate thing on the part of the writer, again, to make it clear who the creative power is.
I don't know how it is in Hebrew, but in English, this isn't a very strange way of talking. I mean, imagine that you're hanging out with your mom and she says, I know what let's do. Let's make some cookies. Mm-hmm. And then you sit there and hang out with her and she does all the making of the cookies. Right.
That's a good illustration. The geek way, the geek talk here would be, this is a plural of exhortation. A singular speaker exhorting, announcing an intention, exhorting people to, hey, let's get involved here. We're going to do X, Y, Z. And then, of course, you only have one person doing it. But there's a peripheral benefit, in some context to it.
There are, as you probably know, many, many famous appeals that Christians make to the Jewish Bible. One of the most famous ones, for example, is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God says, let us make man in our image, right? And somehow this phrase, let us make man, again, supposedly proves the Christian idea of the Trinity. Now, this assertion is really so weak. Someone asked before about Christian scholars. You should know that most Christian scholars, even the most Trinitarian Christian scholars, say this passage has absolutely nothing to do with the Trinity. You should know that most Christian scholars, even the most Trinitarian Christian scholars, say this passage has absolutely nothing to do with the Trinity. You should know that most Christian scholars, even the most Trinitarian Christian scholars, say this passage has absolutely nothing to do with the Trinity. They will either say that this passage where God says, let us make man in our image, they refer to it either as God addressing the celestial beings in heaven. So in the creation of man, God addresses the angels, the heavenly court, and God speaks to the angels and says, let us create man. The rabbis say that what God is doing basically is teaching an ethical lesson that when we do something, we should consult with our subordinates. Or, and this is not just a Jewish assertion, many Christian commentaries, the most conservative evangelical ones say, that's what's going on here, that God is addressing the angels. Other Christian commentaries, as well as Jewish commentaries, say this is what's referred to as the plural of majesty.
Plural of majesty was not used in Hebrew at that time. It was not convention.
That we see examples in the Bible where a king will speak in the plural. In Daniel, there's a passage where the king says, "What shall we do?" Right? He didn't become all of a sudden a person with split personalities. But it's common, editorial writers will speak in the we, it's called the editorial we, and royalty will speak, what will we do? So in the Bible, God says, let us create man. Those are the two most popular theories in terms of explaining why the Bible would say, let us create man.
And what we find is there's one verse that's used often by evangelical missionaries to prove again that there's a plurality within God. Genesis 1:26, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. This is a well-known verse, and Christians will say, aha, here you have an open proof, a clear example where there's a plurality within the Godhead. There is not one God alone, just God the Father who you Jews pray to, but there's many, there's more than one. That's why it says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man in our image. Now, one of the reasons why I usually don't cover this is because this argument is so erroneous. It lacks so much foundation. It says so much about the person who is bringing it up. That even the vast majority of Christian scholars who are Trinitarians will tell you that this in no way points to the Trinity. None of these men would be considered a foe of the Trinity. G.J. Wenham. Christians have traditionally seen Genesis 1:26 as enumerating. By the way, I always feel that anyone who uses such a fancy word like that has to be right, which means foreshadowing the Trinity. It is now universally admitted that this was not what the plural meant to the original author. If you take out an NIV study Bible, these are not Unitarians here. If you look under the commentary of Genesis 1:26, where it says us, our, God speaks as the Creator King, announcing his crowning work to the members of his heavenly court. The Ryrie Study Bible, oh boy, I mean, the person who put that together comes from Dallas Theological Seminary. We're dealing with a very conservative Christian here. We're not dealing with liberals here. The plurals of majesty. The Liberty Annotated Study Bible. Did you ever hear of Jerry Falwell? Oh boy, right? He's certainly no foe of the Trinity. It explains that this is certainly most likely speaking of a majestic plurality. What do these men mean? Why are they saying this? I mean, they're all people that would have loved to use Genesis 1:26 as a proof of the Trinity. There would be no question that if they saw there was any way to use it, they would love to put their hands on it. Even they understand that they're going to have to forego Genesis 1:26.
Is some people will say to me, but Nabeel, the Trinity is not present in the Old Testament. This is something new that Christians came up with.
Is that the concept of the Trinity only came up after Christians already accepted the deity of Jesus. It was an effort, a philosophical effort to justify something they believed already, an absurdity they believed already. To believe a man is God, they had to come up with an idea of the Trinity. It wasn't that they first came up with the idea of the Trinity and then they said, oh, Jesus is the one that fits into the Trinity. Before Jesus came to the world, no one thought of the Trinity. So the Trinity is an excuse for idolatry.